You hear academics talking about a paradigm shift. What are they talking about? They're talking about a society deciding to look at something in a very different way than they have previously. All right? The one, of course, that we're talking about tonight is environmentalism. And people say, oh, you don't care about the environment. I care more about the environment than anybody I know. I've served on commissions, and I've set up boards of soil conservation, water conservation, all sorts of attempts to deal with environmental issues. But see, what happens with a paradigm shift is that there's a few people that look at it and say, hey, there's an opportunity for me here. And the opportunity is either financial or political or worse, both, okay? And so those people grab that idea and exploit it. And I'm going to suggest to you that environmentalism was an absolutely necessary new paradigm. But what happened was a group of people grabbed it and took the moral high ground with it and used it to control everybody else. They are in fact on the verge of, the environmentalists are on the verge of destroying environmentalism, because the public are getting fed up with it. They're getting fed up with what I call eco-bullying. They're getting fed up with being pushed around. And so, of course, the problem is that if they push back and they lie to them too much, the public will say, we don't believe anything you tell us. Then real issues won't get dealt with. That's the danger. It's in that old Aesop's fable about the wolf, crying wolf. And we're on the verge of that with environmental issues right now. So, and by the way, I'll give you an example of a paradigm shift that you can all relate to. Feminism. Absolutely necessary change needed. Still a lot of changes needed. And when you look at what's going on around the world, absolutely essential. But you see, here's the problem with a new paradigm. Most people don't see or understand what the paradigm really means for them. And not only that, but there are fears of it. Why? Because a paradigm shift means change. And we're all small c conservative. We're afraid of change because we know when there's change, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And the loser just might be me. So there's a hesitancy. And they don't quite, so that small group that grabbed the idea and then exploit it, and the rest are sitting there saying, and the women were saying, well, how far do we go with this feminist thing? And then I discovered over my career looking at this that there's a very important idea with this. I used to wonder, what was the role of extremists? What's their purpose? It's kind of like, what, if we got rid of all the mosquitoes, would the world really come to an end? You know, what's the role of extremists? I finally discovered what it is. The role of the extremist is to define the limits for the rest of us. That's the role of the extremist. So with the feminist movement, women are saying, well, yay, there's some good things here, but I'm not so sure. And then somebody started doing something crazy, some woman, the bra burning, whatever you want to talk about. And suddenly the women say, no. Now we're losing more than we're gaining. No, that extremists had defined the limits. That's starting to happen with the environmental movement. And it's starting to happen because people are seeing the cost in jobs, the cost in damage to society, structures of society, and so on. So they're starting to push back a little bit. It's one of the reasons we're here talking tonight. And so paradigm shifts, as I said, very essential in the environmentalist thing. Now, there's one other thing with environmentalism, because if you look at the bookshelves, you'll see there's a lot of books about Darwin. Richard Dawkins talking about Darwin. And is God dead? That's one of the debates that's going on in the academic world about all of this, and certainly with the young people. Now, Darwin, of course, was an atheist, and for the reason that most men become atheists, he had a young daughter who died. And Darwin said, I can understand a God that tests adults, but I can't understand a God that would test children. And that, as I said, is the reason why most men become atheists. But Darwin was used by science to defeat religion. And I'm not here to argue pro or for, whatever. But in defeating religion, of course, then you take away the reason for humans being here. Right? Well, we're here because God put us here. Well, you get rid of that, and then, well, why are we here? Do you know what change that made to the world? Enormous. Because if you went to the university in Darwin's day, if you went to Oxford University, and here's the Bodleian Library, one of the great libraries of the world, there were 3 doors to that library. There was the door to the humanities, which included history and religion and language and so on. And then there was a door to the natural sciences. And then the third door was to the library. What door was missing? What door is the largest door in any modern university? The social sciences. Okay? The social sciences emerged because that was the scientific world's way of trying to justify why humans are different than all the other animals. Okay? This is what the social sciences are about. Now, I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm going to bring this in very briefly. But the anthropologists, you can look at this, and I talked and worked with anthropologists. What did they say? Well, we're different from other apes because we walk upright. We call us, Homo erectus. And then they discovered other apes walking upright. Oh, that doesn't work. And then they said, oh, we're the tool maker. So they called us Homo John Deere. No, sorry. We've got to be quick after supper here. So they called us Homo habilis. And by the way, I got to give an introductory lecture to Jane Goodall, the chimpanzee woman, and in Winnipeg a few years ago. It gave me the best opening line I ever produced, because I got up and said, I never dreamed I'd be a warm-up act for chimpanzees, but here I am. But Jane Goodall, of course, discovered chimpanzees making tools. And there are other animals seen now making tools. So suddenly now, we're not alone in that. So then they said, well, what makes us different? Well, we can think conceptually. We can take two ideas and produce a third idea. So we call ourselves, very arrogantly, Homo sapiens, the wise ape. Right? But then they put boxes in the corner of a room, hung bananas from a high ceiling, and the chimps came in and very quickly piled up the boxes and got the bananas. Scratch the wise ape. Okay? Now, this part's going to shock you because, well, where do we go from here? They decided that what makes humans different than the other apes is that we can tell lies. Doesn't that make your human chest swell with pride? Right? And so, well, then what do we name ourselves? Well, we call ourselves the doubly wise ape, Homo sapiens sapiens. Why? Because lying is a double concept. You have to think of the truth and then a way around the truth. Right? It has to be premeditated. And so we called ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens. Well, you can read about this. It was in National Geographic. They taught a gorilla American Sign Language, had a vocabulary of 300 words, which meant it could graduate from grade 12. And they were watching the gorilla through a one-way glass. The gorilla was playing with a toy. It broke the toy. It hid the toy. They went in and said to the gorilla, who broke the toy? And he pointed at the other gorilla. So I say to my anthropologist friends, well, what's your thinking now? What makes us different than the other apes? And he said, well, what we're thinking is that we're the only animal that can think about death, can think about an afterlife. And I said, well, hang on a minute. I've seen those videos of elephants picking up bones and wandering around. There's something going on there. And he said, well, yeah, but generally we're... And then I thought, well, if we can think about an afterlife, if we can think about death, isn't that where we came in? Isn't that religion? And that's where the social sciences are at this point. And so you start to understand the dynamics of what goes on in academia and how these different things emerge. But of course, once you got rid of God and religion, for most of the young people, and by the way, I was talking to one of my larger classes, and I love to get them on the edge of their seats. And I used to tell them I poked their brain, but the brain's got no nerves, so you're okay, it won't hurt. But I said something quite outrageous, and one of the students blurted out, I don't believe you. And of course, all the other students go, yeah, that's it, the red pencil sword of Damocles descends through his brain. And then, as it quietened down, I said to him, I don't believe you, Thomas. And he said, my name isn't Thomas. Yeah, and I said, how many in the room know what I'm referring to? And of course, what I was referring to was doubting Thomas in the Bible, right? Only 2 students in that class of over 350 had heard of that. So what you've got now are open minds, because I happen to think we're the moral ape. I think that's what makes us different, okay? And whether we like it or not, we have to have a belief system of some sort. So the young people were very vulnerable to environmentalism as the new religion that has effectively become a religion for them. And of course, cartoonists who see the world much more starkly than most of us, and here's a cartoon that appears, First Church of Our Lady of the Environment, okay? And by the way, I'll use a few cartoons because I think in cartoons, bumper stickers, and T-shirts, that's where the intelligent comments about the world are made. Right? My favorite one in Victoria it says, "Do you want to talk to the man in charge or the woman who knows everything?" I love that. I don't care if you can't make any sense out of this. This is a simplified diagram of the weather, with the sunlight coming in at the top here and heat coming in from the oceans, and how it all gets mixed up. When you stand outside, you experience the weather. That is the sum total of everything from cosmic radiation in deep space to heat coming off the bottom of the oceans and everything in between. All right? It is what engineers call a white noise. It's as if you were standing outside of a football stadium and you're 100,000 people. That's a white noise. And what they're trying to tell you is that we know enough about the climate and the weather to be able to pick out individual noises in that stadium. And I'm here to tell you we don't and we can't. But what have they done? They've picked out one of those individual noises, and I want you to think about this. They've chosen CO2. Why did that become the focus? It's such a minuscule part of the total atmosphere, as we'll see. So there must have been some reason that it became the focus of everything. And that's what we need to talk about here, what we need to understand that you haven't been shown. Now, it is, of course, I'll just flip back for a second, but it is, of course, in the graph here, it's in with atmospheric composition. But that's only one gas in the atmosphere. There's nitrogen and oxygen, which are 98% of the atmosphere. And then there are what are called the greenhouse gases. And this is where the deception begins, because this shows you the greenhouse gas percentages. But look at this. Here's CO2, 4% of the greenhouse gases. What's the biggest greenhouse gas? The most important greenhouse gas is water vapor. It's 95%. You know that here. You know that if you've got an evening with clear skies and the heat escapes, the temperature's going to drop and you're going to get frost probably in the spring or the fall. But if you've got high humidity and you've got clouds around, the temperature stays up because the water vapor is acting in trapping and holding the heat in. You go to Insula in southern Algeria in 1943, they recorded a temperature change. It was minus 3.6 at midnight, and by noon the next day it was plus 52 degrees Celsius. That is a phenomenal change of temperature. Why? Because there's no water vapor in the desert. The CO2 makes no difference whatsoever. No difference whatsoever. But you see, this is what they wanted you to focus on, and that's the question we need to ask ourselves here tonight. And here's how it gets misinterpreted. There's that same pie chart, and this is right off of ABC News' website that the young people go and get. It says, this graph shows the distribution of greenhouse gases in Earth's atmosphere. Carbon dioxide is clearly the majority. It doesn't even show water vapor. 95% of what our greenhouse gases is left out of this graph. This is 100% wrong. And yet there it is on ABC News' website. And then you start to understand why the people are confused about what's going on, how easily they are misled. I wanted to get a graph that was long enough to cover everybody in the room. This is 420,000 years. You know, when I joined the Canadian Air Force, one of the old sweats said, you know, if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't have joined. And I didn't realize how serious he was till I got assigned to the Arctic Search and Rescue Squadron. And the oldest aircrew member we had was 36. The youngest airplane we had was 43. Right? And we had an old DC-3 that had been used for towing targets during the war, and the whole frame had been stretched out. The plane was 3 inches longer than when it was built. The problem was that meant a 3-inch gap in the door, which when you're flying search and rescue in the Arctic is not exactly a nice thing to have. But anyway, 420,000 years, well, if it doesn't cover your age, it covers your mortgage, all right? So we're all right there. What this shows, this came out in 1991, and it was presented as proof that CO2 was driving temperature. Here's the current temperature of the Earth over here, and the blue line is the temperature, the red line is CO2. And the French researchers that brought this out, to Petit and Jouzel, but they were warning. They said, don't rush to judgment on this graph. Because if you look at this graph, when it's in a book, that's about 4 inches of graph that's covering 420,000 years. How much detail can you see? The answer is virtually nothing. Okay? Well, within 5 years, and they were saying, oh, this is proof. This is what these people that were using climate for a political agenda, they said this is proof that the temperature is driving, or CO2 is driving temperature. We knew within 5 years that it showed exactly the opposite. That the temperature changes before the CO2 changes. But what's the whole fundamental assumption that they make? They say, oh, CO2 goes up, the temperature will go up. That doesn't occur in any record anywhere in the world at any time in history. Nowhere. In fact, exactly the opposite happens. So the fundamental assumption they make about CO2 and temperature is wrong. But they blithely carry on because they know the public don't know that and don't understand that. So you can see that here. But by the way, well, I'll show you another graph. This shows you 600 million years of the Earth's history. I love it when they come on the radio and they say, oh, it's the hottest day ever. Oh, boy, am I glad I lived long enough to see this. And I like to phone in and say, do you really mean ever? Well, no, it's in government record. Oh, that. How did we ever survive before there was government? My goodness, it's amazing. And of course, that's something that you've got to look at. What this shows is the current level, CO2 is the red line. And here we are at the current level, 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And Al Gore tells you that's the highest level we've ever had. Look at this graph. It is in fact the lowest level we've ever had. Okay? And in fact, you could argue, looking at here, the last 300 million years, that the CO2 level has averaged around 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million. 3 times what we've currently got. And do you know how we know that's important to the Earth? Because if you go to the greenhouses on the coast here, the commercial greenhouses, they pump up to 1,200 parts per million of CO2 to get the plants to grow more vigorously. In fact, you could, and Dr. Idso has done 30 years of research showing that increased CO2 increases the yield of the plant. And it also, by the way, reduces the amount of water it uses. So I think that that's 300 million years of evolution of plants to an optimum level of about 1,200 parts per million. So you could argue, say, the plants are malnourished at 400 parts per million. Here's another interesting thing. About 480,000 or 480 million years ago, 438 million years, sorry, when the Democrats were still in power. Sorry. Remember, if you can't take a joke. But here's the temperature. The blue line is the temperature. This is the Ordovician Ice Age, 438 million years ago. An ice age. But what's the level of CO2? 4,000 parts per million. And they're telling you at 400 parts per million, we're in runaway potential of global warming. The evidence doesn't support anything that they're saying. Nothing. but they still push that agenda.